This is a graph of the Canadian population broken down by race. And this is what the Canadian prison population looks like. Look at the overrepresentation of Indigenous offenders in our prisons. I think this is a problem, and practically everybody agrees, even the Canadian government. To quote from the Correctional Investigator, Canada's correctional population is becoming disturbingly and unconscionably indigenized. In 2005, Indigenous offenders made up 18% of the Canadian prison population. In 2025, that number is 32%. In women's prisons, roughly 1 in 2 offenders are Indigenous. This is a major problem that needs to be reversed. And today, I'm going to talk about how we got here and what we can do to reverse this. I think we should start right from the beginning. When European settlers came over to North America, they wanted ownership over the land. But to their surprise, they soon discovered that Indigenous nations outnumbered them 10-1. This land wasn't Europe, and they couldn't just march in with their army and take the land by force. So they made agreements with these nations to share the land, agreements made on a nation-to-nation level. But European settlers never lost sight of their goal of conquering all of North America. To do this, they needed to level the playing field, and that meant creating instability within Indigenous nations and dependency on trading with European settlers. One of the ways they did this was introducing these nations to alcohol, causing new addictions that these nations had no defense against. The second part of this plan was to spread diseases like smallpox, notably through the trading of Hudson's Bay blankets. In 1763, Commander-in-Chief of British forces in North America, Geoffrey Amherst, wrote in a letter, and I quote, "You will do well to try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets, as well as try every other method that can serve to extirpate this execrable race." Diseases like smallpox, influenza, and measles decimated the population of Indigenous nations and entered them into an era of instability, with some sources estimating that 95% of the Indigenous population died to disease. While that number varies from source to source, the damage that was done is clear. Once the settlers accomplished this instability, they gained massive power over these Indigenous nations. And when those nations fought back for their right to exist, that resistance was rebranded from a nation-to-nation conflict to treason against the Canadian state. This is the beginning of the criminalization of the Indigenous identity. Caricatures were created that Indigenous people were savage drunks that needed to be civilized. Even our first Prime Minister used this language and created residential schools from that justification. From there, the RCMP was used to steal Indigenous children from their families and force them into residential schools, where they would only see their family twice a year, if that. At every stage of this broken relationship, our justice system was used to oppress the rights of Indigenous people. Now that we have closed down residential schools, we still have not given Indigenous communities the support they need to heal. There is a cycle of trauma from residential school survivors that exists to this day. Their traumatic childhood has led to them not knowing how to cope with their past, how to raise their own children, and when they make mistakes, like all of us do. Does our justice system help them? Does it give them the tools they need to succeed? No. We throw them into an underfunded prison and traumatize them more. From the cradle to the grave, our justice system has failed Indigenous people, and it is no surprise why they are so overrepresented in our prisons. So let's talk about how to fix this. I'm here to tell you about restorative justice, a new take on sentencing that works to help offenders become better people. Restorative justice is an alternate form of sentencing that brings the offender together with the victim to heal the damage that is done. In this model, the offender can see the damage they have caused and take accountability for their actions, while the victim can feel empowered to tell their story and reach a conclusion. When we send offenders to prison, they may never see their victim again, preventing them from understanding the gravity of their actions. When restorative justice is chosen instead of incarceration, oftentimes the two will enter into a circle with a mediator and talk it out, and from there develop a plan to resolve the situation. For example, if an offender damages a victim's property, a solution restorative justice may suggest is having the offender repair the damage that they did. This way the offender can make up for their wrongs, but the victim can have their property repaired, just like before. When we simply send the offender to prison, they have no way of understanding the consequences of their actions, while the victim is left in the dark. The Canadian government did a study on recidivism rates between offenders who participated in a restorative justice program compared to offenders who were given probation. And what they found was that those who went through restorative justice had a lower rate of reoffending. I think that we should be using this method more, especially with young Indigenous offenders. The cycle of violence we talked about earlier puts many Indigenous youth in contact with the law. When incarcerated, they often face further trauma inside our prisons that lowers their chance of successful reintegration back into society. Restorative justice avoids that fate while actually showing offenders why what they did was bad. This is the type of solution we need to counter the Indigenous overrepresentation in our prisons. It is the belief that an offender is not all bad, is able to change, and doesn't always need to be locked away to protect society. Many aren't the danger that we fear when we hear the word criminal. We just need to give them the chance to be better. And sure, there are always cases of offenders that cannot be rehabilitated. This model will not work on everyone. But the status quo for offenders is locking them up, throwing them into a prison that doesn't rehabilitate them, and often makes them worse. This is why we have the problems we have today. The data backs this up. It makes more sense, so let's make changes and do this. And that's all I have for today's video. I hope you're able to learn a little bit more about how Indigenous people have been mistreated in the past and also how that affects us in the present. And I hope I've been able to tell a more complete story of a story that often goes untold. And when it is told, important parts are often left out and voices are left out of the room. So, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Take care.